All right, I'm so excited for Wine Down Wednesday that we have with us Louisa Rose, who is the winemaker of our Pewsey Vale Dry Riesling that we're going to be tasting this month. And I'm so glad that she was able to come with me, although recorded, to share her thoughts on this wine. So Louisa, thank you so much for being with us.
Oh, it's my pleasure, and I'm sorry I can't be there right at the right time, but isn't technology wonderful?
You know what? Just being able to listen to your amazing Australian accent, we all feel transported to, down under. And I think I mentioned to you earlier that I got the pleasure to be there for 3 weeks in Australia in 2001. I barely scratched the surface though, but about a week of that in South Australia, a little bit of time in the Hunter, but I'm excited to talk about Pewsey Vale Dry Riesling. I'm obsessed with getting people to try dry Riesling from Australia. I feel like so many people don't understand how great it is. But before we delve into the wine, because I'm ready for a sip, I wondered if you could so many people have this dream and always want to know how women and different amazing people get into winemaking. How did you get into the position of being the head winemaker at Yalumba and also, of course, making the wines of Pewsey Vale?
Well, it's been something that I've been involved in really all my life. So I grew up in Melbourne, in Victoria, which is the sort of the next state over from where I am now in South Australia. And my family started to plant a vineyard in the late 1970s. So my weekends, when I wasn't at school, weekends and holidays were all spent up, on this on the farm that turned into a vineyard. And we went through the cycles and the seasons of planting and as the vines grew and pruning and training, and then after a couple of years we started to have grapes and pick them. And I remember in the early 80s taking our first vintage to the winery that was buying the grapes, and we'd been picking them all day and the sun had gone down and this winery was there sort of lit up like a Christmas tree. And it looked so exciting and so interesting. And I remember thinking at the time, as a young teenager, wow, I think I want to be a winemaker. I actually had no idea what that meant, but I sort of kept that in my mind. And I love science, and I did a science degree, at Melbourne University. And then I came to South Australia in the early 90s to study winemaking, which is also a science degree, but not one that you can do, or applied science degree, not one that you can do at every university. So I came to South Australia to Adelaide University to study that, and got a job at Yalumba in 1992, and I've never left. So that's where I am today.
Wonderful. Well, that's an amazing story, but it's how great that you had that experience so young with the vineyards to even know, now that I'm a sommelier, I always joke, I didn't grow up wanting to be a sommelier because I didn't know what that was. My parents would have, wine at parties, but it wasn't a big part of their life. So that's such an amazing opportunity. And Adelaide was almost my daughter's name because that was the one city that I just loved so much. And so how great to be able to be there. So, well, let's talk about Riesling. I know you make so many different kinds of wine, and Viognier is a grape that we grow here in Maryland and Virginia. And I know you're a big proponent of that, but I hear your favorite is Riesling, and this Pewsey Vale has been my favorite for years. So let's talk a little bit about it because everyone's going to be tasting it.
Right. Well, I do love Riesling, and I remember growing up, when we weren't, out in the vineyards, but I can remember my parents drinking Riesling, and I can remember them drinking Pewsey Vale Riesling. It's a wine that's been, in the hearts and, fondly remembered by many Australians for many decades. So, but like most Australian Rieslings, it is dry, and that, is the style that's developed in Australia, really because it's the best way that we find that our grapes are balanced. We have lots of sunshine. We grow Riesling, for example, I'm in the Eden Valley, which is where I am now. One of the really well-known regions for Riesling, and we have these beautiful sunny days, so the grapes get beautiful and ripe, and then we have these cold nights that even during summer sometimes get close to freezing. So they're really cold, and that keeps the beautiful natural acidity and those delicate flavors in the grapes overnight. And then, they continue to ripen the next day. And and so on and so on as they ripen into fall. And so when we do the fermentation and the yeast turns the sugar into alcohol, the best balance, when we taste the wines is to have all of the natural sugar really fermented into alcohol. So we don't need residual sugar in there to balance the acidity, because the best balance we think is dry, and that happens across most of the wine growing regions in Australia where Riesling is grown, which is large, even though we have Riesling. We know that Riesling was first planted on the Pewsey Vale Vineyard in 1847. And those wines were dry as well.
Mm. It's just a few years ago. I was amazed when I was traveling over there, the vines that were hundreds of years old that we don't see that here in the States. And so that's such great history. And, Riesling can be very misunderstood over here in the US. I don't know, because people maybe had some sweet styles or German Rieslings on the sweet spectrum, and they think that's all there is to Riesling. And so I know when I first started trying these drier versions from Australia, I was so pleased because you have that citrus profile in there, but also the floral notes and those herbaceous notes that just make it different, and that the balanced acidity. I love that you say balanced, because to me that's exactly, it's not like overly in your face acidity like maybe a Sauvignon Blanc might be, but the fruit, the acid, the body, all of it just feels like this is the all-around most balanced wine ever.
Yeah, and look, if we wanted to make a sweet style, this wine, as these grapes were picked, it wouldn't be balanced. It would be quite it would just feel sort of sweet and not that lovely sort of refreshing character that you want to get from Riesling. Yeah. But don't get me wrong. I love for example, those beautiful Rieslings that come out of the Mosel. So many of them which have residual sugar, because they, the way those grapes are grown and the picking decisions that are made around those grapes, mean that they need some residual sugar to balance that acidity. And I think, when it's right, it just sings. And that's the great thing I think about Riesling all over the world, is that it's so much a representation of where it comes from. Yeah. And the purity of them, because these are wines typically that wouldn't be aged in oak barrels. They're just, fermented in a stainless steel tank in most cases. And then, we put them in the bottle. So there's not, we're not creating a whole lot of other winemaking, characters in the wine. It's just about the wine itself, which really is just about the grapes and where they've come from. So, I always talk about Riesling as being the mirror of terroir, and that lovely sort of journey you can go right around the world. And, you guys have, a lot of Riesling in America growing as well, in different regions. Washington State grows, some beautiful Rieslings, and then you see them around some of the, the Great Lakes, and again, some of those styles are, have beautiful, natural acidities that can handle some sugar in the balance of them. So, it's not, I've never sort of think it's as simple as saying, oh, well, we make dry Riesling because, that's a better style. We make dry Riesling because that's what works on the Pewsey Vale Vineyard and in most regions in Australia.
Oh, that's a great point. And next month for our Wine Down Wednesday, we are featuring the wines of Dr. Constantine Frank out of the Finger Lakes of New York. And he was sort of one of the pioneers, of course, of the East Coast winemaking and bringing those European grapes to the East Coast. So
yeah, and in fact, and it was very remiss of me not to mention those, because not only is are they making some amazing wines up there, but I also one of the most beautiful places I've been to in the world. So
oh wow, great!
Yeah,
well,
fantastic.
I'm married to a chef, very lucky in that regard, and we're all about wine with food. And what would be your favorite pairings for this Riesling?
Well, I have to say that I do rather love doing Riesling for breakfast. I don't do it necessarily on a work day, but it's, I'm recording this, in my morning, and I'm quite happy sitting here, sipping a glass of Riesling at 9 o'clock in the morning. So,
sure.
Yeah. So, and it is lovely, if you have a, breakfast, or maybe, a weekend brunch, and, and you've got some, grilled tomatoes or some, an omelette or pancakes, or, that's the sort of thing that Riesling goes beautifully with. Yeah. But we, throughout the rest of the day, we often drink Riesling as an aperitif sort of style. So it's a great way to start off an occasion, or I drink it. I drink it a lot while I'm cooking, and then continue drinking it while I'm, when I'm eating the food. But seafood is wonderful here in South Australia. We have some beautiful oysters and fresh sea fish, and it grows beautifully with that. In fact, I often like, putting a little bit of Riesling in the oyster shell. When you might squeeze, a bit of lemon on it, you put a little bit of Riesling in there instead, and that's quite fun to do. It's great with salads, and it's beautiful then with with spicy sort of fresh Asian food styles and things like that as well. One of the great things about Riesling, and not obviously what we're tasting today, but it is one of the great aging varieties of the world as well. And if you have, and not just from here, but we know how well Eden Valley Riesling and Pewsey Vale Riesling particularly does age. And as it ages, it gets richer, and it develops more toast and marmalade and honey characters, sort of overlaying that beautiful fruit spectrum that you've already described so well. And as the wines age and develop that richness, they become really great pairings for richer foods. And so I love having aged Riesling, with duck, for example, or veal, or again, spicy, but maybe curries and things that have got some more richness and earthiness to them. Compared to some of those, perhaps those sort of fresher Thai styles that you might have with a young Riesling.
Yeah, I'm actually going to have this with some sushi in a little bit here.
Perfect, yeah.
It's going to be delicious. But I know you have, various different Rieslings that you make, and that is the specialty at Pewsey Vale. That's what you do. That's all you do. Are all of them ageable, or just specific ones?
Any of them you could age. Okay. We do make a wine which we release as an aged wine called the Contours from Pewsey Vale. Okay. And that wine we release usually with about 6 years of bottle age on it. So we've already done the hard work there for 6 years, but you could age that for another, 5 or 10 or 15 or however many years you wanted to. And the wine, obviously not the wine bottles that we have because we've opened them, but if we hadn't opened them, they would be fantastic to cellar. Again, at 5 years, you're just starting to see that development come through, and then, it just continues slowly to develop and age over time. And depending on how much of that developed character people like, they can age for, 20 or 30 years. And I think when they get to about that sort of 25 years, they probably, plateau and don't change a lot after that. But, it's one of the great things about screw cap, of course, too, is that you can age them very reliably.
Yep. That's great. I know you guys are the pioneers, sort of the forefront of that, although we're seeing it a ton more now. But in December, we're going to be loving this month, the dry Riesling. But in December, we're doing a Wine Down Wednesday called Holiday Must-Have Wines. And I chose the Yalumba Antique Muscat for one of our choices for a fun dessert selection to keep around the house for whether it be Thanksgiving, well, it would be holiday, Christmas or Hanukkah or New Year's at that point. So I know you're connected with Yalumba too. So I just wondered, don't give everything away, but give them a little something, a teaser to make them want to come back in December and find out more about this delicious wine.
Sure. So a really classic Australian style, word for which is that antique muscat, and so it's a fortified wine, which means that it's got a lot of beautiful rich sweetness and that comes from the grapes, because instead of letting them ferment to dryness like we would with the Riesling, we've added a brandy spirit to give it the alcohol, and it can keep that beautiful sort of sugar, and then it's aged in barrels for many years. So the muscat is usually around that 10 years of age on average, but there are components of that wine, because it's a non-vintage wine, that are much, much older. So, some of that, that wine that's in that, bottle is over 20 years that it would have been sitting in those barrels. So beautiful, rich, fragrant, and just absolutely delicious to have, with the beautiful, holiday seasonal fare.
Yeah.
It's great. It really is a beautiful wine to have, with desserts, but you could equally love it with, cheese or, dried fruit or, that sort of thing at the end of a meal as well.
And I think I remember from my visit that they call them stickies. wines like that?
Yeah. Because of that, because they've got so much residual sugar in there. Yes,
So yeah, just so we
they
get
are
the
a bit
lingo
tricky, but
down.
they are delicious.
If we come over to visit you, we want to make sure we're saying it right.
Yeah. No,
Well,
you've definitely got that. You've definitely got that one down.
thank you so much for taking the time to join us on Wine Down Wednesday. I know everyone's going to love the dry Riesling as much as I do. And I hope someday to come back over and get to see you in there in South Australia, one of the most beautiful places in the world. So I appreciate your time. And I know everyone's going to be so happy to see you. So thank you so much.
Absolute pleasure. Have a life.
Thank
Bye.
you.